Everyone,
Good morning.
we are learning Mishnah's Kesubos, Perek Vav, Chapter 6, Mishnah Hey, Mishnah 5. Now, as we've been learning, it is a mitzvah for a father to provide a dowry for his daughter. So now, the Mishnah is going to tell us what's the minimum that he has to give as a dowry. Hamasi espitoi stam. If a person marries off his daughter without specifying the amount of what he's giving her for a dowry. Lo yivchas la mechamishim zuz. He may not give less than 50 zuz. 50 zuz is the minimum that he must give as a dowry. That's the first part of the Mishnah. Now, next part of the Mishnah deals with the following. So that's the minimum amount of dowry. The next is, let me read to you a little bit of an introduction here. A husband's obligation to provide his wife with clothing. We've learned previously that a husband has to provide clothing for his wife. Does not take effect until after the wedding, meaning after the chuppah, when she moves into his home. It is the father who supplies her clothing until then. The Mishnah states the law where her father and husband agreed that the husband would start giving her clothes before the wedding. That was the deal. It's supposed to be that until she comes to the chuppah, it is the father's obligation to give her clothing. When she comes into his house after chuppah, that's when his obligation begins. Our Mishnah, that's when the husband's obligation begins. Our Mishnah deals with a deal that the husband says he will start giving her clothing before the wedding. He's going to start supplying the clothing before the wedding. So that's what it means here. Pasuk lachnisa aruma. If the father made up to bring her into the husband's domain without the commitment to clothe her. That means that's a way of saying that the husband took on the obligation to clothe her even before the marriage. The father made up to bring her into the marriage without the clothing, meaning without the obligation of clothing her. So rather, it was made up. The husband's going to start giving her clothes even before their marriage. Okay? So now, lo yemer abal, the husband may not say, k'sha'achnisa lebesi, that when I bring her into my house, achasera b'chsusi, that's when I will cover her, that's when I'll clothe her with my clothing. Let me just read the words here. Elamachasa v'oid b'beis aviyah. He covers her, he clothes her, even while she is in her father's home. So what that means is like this. What that means is that, all right, so they made a deal here, that even before the chuppah, he's going to provide her with clothing. Fine. But what kind of clothing? So to speak, what level of clothing? If let's say we're talking about that she comes from, let's say, a poor home, he comes from a wealthier home. So the halacha is that once he brings her into the house, he's got to clothe her, not according to the way she used to be by her father. He's got to clothe her according to the way the women in his family are dressed. Okay? The question here is, though, before she actually comes to his house, even though he took upon himself to give her the clothing, maybe all he has to do is give her the clothing according to her level, because she's still in the house. Who says I have to start now giving her the higher level of clothing? When she comes into my house, I'll give her the better clothing. But right now she's by her father. I can give her the kind of clothing that they dress by in her father's home, which is poorer. So that's what the Mishnah says. You can't do that. You can't say, that's what it means. Kashachnisa lebesi. If the husband can't say, when I bring her into my house, achasera b'chsusi, I will cover her with my clothing, meaning with my level of clothing. We can't wait until then. He clothes her with the level of clothing of his family, even while she's still in her father's home. Now, they explain here that the bride and her father would be embarrassed if she went from his house to her groom's house for the chuppah, dressed in the clothing of poor people, and not the elegant garments that are appropriate for this special occasion. Therefore, once husband accepts to provide her with clothing, he must dress her in a manner that accords with his higher social status. Meaning, why did they do this? The answer they did this is because, imagine, she's going to come to the chuppah wearing the clothing of a poor man's daughter, and she's marrying into a richer family where the clothing is going to be on a higher level. But the husband wants to say, but she's not in my house yet, so who says I have to give it to her? So the Chachamim said that no, in order not to embarrass her and her father when she's coming to the chuppah, you already got starting to dress her appropriately, even while she's by her still in her father's house, but you accepted to clothe her then. Next. Going back to the beginning of the Mishnah, that the Mishnah had mentioned that if a person, the minimum dowry a person gives for his daughter is 50 zuz. So the same thing applies to a person who, let's say, is marrying off an orphan. She doesn't have a father to do it, so somebody else is doing it. Who's this other person? The Gabbai Tzedakah, the person who's in charge of the tzedakah in the community. He is the one who is now dealing with marrying off this orphan girl. So the Mishnah says he also may not give less than 50 zuz for her dowry. And the point of the Mishnah here is he cannot give less than 50 zuz, even if there are no charitable funds available. Meaning there's no money in the fund. Even so, if he is marrying off, he has a responsibility, he's taking the responsibility to marry her off, and he's doing so, he must even borrow money in order to make sure that she comes into the marriage with at least 50 zuz. Im yesh bakis, then the Mishnah concludes, now if there is in the fund, meaning there's money in the fund, then we say, then we support her according to the manner that befits her status. Meaning if there is money in the charity fund, and there's no need to borrow, at that point, we don't just say, 50 zuz, right? Then we have to actually look at her status and figure out how much she should be getting based on her father, on what would based on her, we calls her status, means based on the status of the family she came from. So if there is money in the kiss, we're going to give her a dowry according to the status of the family she came from. But if there is no money, then the Gabbai Tzedakah, the one in charge of tzedakah, who is marrying her off, must provide a dowry of 50 zuz, even if there's no money in the fund, even if he has to go borrow it. Okay, so now the Chofetz Chaim is again discussing the situation where you told someone that they were cheated, and it's a situation where that person may now take things in his own hands and do more than what halacha allows him to do. And you all brought that on because of the fact that you told him about what happened, that he was cheated. And even if it may be that he has the ability to go back to a beis din and deal with it, but here we're dealing with a situation where you told this to a person, and you realized you knew it was such a person who, or at least you knew the potential that this person could, take things in his own hands. And the Chofetz Chaim described all the potential problems that could come from that. So Re'ei kamarois asarei chalazeh. The Chofetz Chaim says, see how many bad things this gossiper did. Number one, he has the potential of transgressing the prohibition of do not go as a gossiper in your nation. Now again, that is if he's not careful with the details said before. If he's not careful with the details said before, for instance, he's only that could be he could actually be transgressing that prohibition. There are ways of not actually transgressing the prohibition, but there are ways that yes, as the Chofetz Chaim said before. He's also transgressing the prohibition of do not put a stumbling block in front of a blind person, meaning which is where we derive not to cause someone else to sin. In a case where you told the guy, go back and give it back to him, and tell him you're not, and if he doesn't give you, go back to him and tell him you want to return it, and if he doesn't want to return it, you're not going to finish paying under circumstance, and which typically, even if there's a right to go ahead and demand something back, you can't do it that way. But you told him to do it. That's called lifnei yiver, causing him to sin. And then you also brought him to quarrel with the guy. He wants to give back the thing, as the Chofetz Chaim said before. He wants to give it back. The seller says, I don't have to take it back. Now, and it turns into a fight. And then what happens during the machlekes? They insult each other. which means then they have transgressed the prohibition of hurting someone with words. So this is all coming about from what the person said. And therefore, it is best not to get involved in any of these kind of these situations, unless he truly contemplates and thinks through everything, all the details mentioned before. If you actually go through all the conditions and you meet them and you're doing it sincerely, you're doing it to help the person, which you should be, which is initially what you should be doing, but if you can't fulfill the details, then you can't help him. But if you have gone through all the details, you've contemplated well, and you are able and ready to do it, again, if you've gone through all the details, you're doing it all according to what the halacha says, then Hashem will help you, that no stumbling will come about, no problems will come about through what you're doing. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much.